At 50 degrees below zero, the Siberian Taiga does not merely exist. It replaces the rules of biology with the absolute laws of physics. In this environment, the atmosphere is not a gas, but a predatory weight that consumes anything that fails to respect its tolerances. On a Tuesday in November 1941, a routine prisoner transport, destined for the deep interior of the Yakutsk region, met a mechanical failure that the official histories of the war would later omit. For Nikolai, a 30-year-old railway engineer, the sudden derailment of the locomotive was not an emotional tragedy. It was a technical problem that required an immediate, disciplined solution. Nikolai was a man trained in the language of steel, a professional who understood stress points and the unyielding choreography of machines. His life had been spent monitoring gauges and listening to the rhythms of engines, and as the steam from the overturned train hissed into the brittle air, he felt the familiar shift from routine to emergency. The exact second when procedure stops being a list and becomes a race. The world around the wreckage flattened into an enormous, lethal map of white and gray. The spruce forests rose in dense clusters that looked like ink spilled across a shroud of snow. It was a landscape that offered no geometry, no roads, and no human cues to suggest the scale of the isolation. The interior of Siberia could swallow a man as neatly as it swallowed the heat from his blood. While the transport guards panicked in the sudden whiteout, Nikolai stood in a silence so complete it felt staged. He carried a competence that, to an outsider, looked like an eerie calm. He was not interested in the heroics of flight. He was focused on the anatomy of failure and the immediate necessity of survival. His departure from the crash site was not a desperate dash, but a series of competing assessments made in seconds. While others fled without a plan, Nikolai moved toward the wreckage of the supply car with the practiced clarity of an inventory clerk. He did not look for weapons, he looked for mechanisms and resources. He grabbed a heavy canvas tarp, a technician's kit, and a small pocket of iron rations. When the guards began firing into the snow, the sounds felt abstract, disconnected from the reality of the cold that was already yanking the moisture from his lungs. He stepped into the treeline, not out of cowardice, but because the calculation was brutal. Staying was a certainty of death, while moving was a gamble on the mechanical truth of his own endurance. As the sound of the guards and the dying engines faded, Nikolai was left with the animal knowledge that nothing separated him from the permafrost except layers of wool and faith in his own pace. The cold at this latitude was not a low temperature. It was an invasive force that turned eyelashes into needles and burned the throat with every breath. He took stock of what he had, a small file, a box of matches, and the canvas tarp. He had no radio, no compass, and no certainty of the horizon. In this country, the nearest human settlement is not a place. It is a theoretical possibility. Nikolai knew that many men die in their first night without making a single heroic mistake, because exposure kills quietly. It begins with the shivering, then the numbness, and finally the kind of fatigue that feels like relief. He understood that he could not be sentimental about his discomfort. Shelter was the only plan. He gathered branches and used the canvas tarp to create a crude cocoon, turning silk-like fabric into insulation. He burrowed into a drift, knowing that snow insulates when you are inside it, rather than on top of it. As the sky darkened, he listened to the forest grow colder, hearing the occasional howl of wolves that reminded him he was not the only creature hungry in the dark. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by violent shivers that spent his calories like gasoline. By morning, his extremities were already threatened. Frostbite does not arrive as a dramatic injury, but as a quiet theft of the body's integrity. He knew he needed fire, not for comfort, but for the permission to exist. In the Siberian Taiga, fire is the only currency that matters. His first match died in the wind, a small failure that felt like a closing door. The second and third flared and vanished, and panic began to press at the edges of his mind. If he wasted the matches, he would be reduced to primitive friction in sub-zero cold with numb hands, a nearly impossible task. On the fourth attempt, he forced himself to slow down, using his body as a windbreak and building a nest of tinder from shaved bark. When the flame finally caught, the heat returned to his fingers with a stabbing pain that meant blood was moving again. He held his hands near the flicker and made a quiet decision that mattered more than any map. He would not die there. For the next 20 days, hunger became a constant ache, an emptiness that narrowed his thoughts into an obsessive focus on fuel. Every movement burned calories, and every calorie was a tax on his survival. He fashioned snares from wire scavenged from the technician's kit, using lessons learned in a childhood that felt like it belonged to another man. His first attempts failed. Some were set too high, others in places where no animal traveled. Each day he checked them with diminishing hope, because hope costs energy if it leads to disappointment. On the sixth day he found a hare. He killed it quickly, not out of mercy, but because a struggle would waste the protein he needed to keep the engine running. The isolation began to do what isolation always does. It altered his relationship with reality. Humans are social animals who calibrate themselves through other voices, and alone for long enough, a person's thoughts begin to echo. Nikolai began talking aloud, reciting railway schedules and engineering formulas to keep his mind organized. It wasn't insanity, it was adaptation. In a place where death could arrive from one tired, stupid mistake, mental clarity was as vital as fire. He followed the logic of the terrain, choosing a frozen tributary because a river is a line through chaos. Travel in the deep snow was grinding work, requiring a controlled pace to avoid the sweat that would steal his heat. He learned to walk like a machine, steady, deliberate, and conserving every gesture. Around day 50, the wilderness offered a rare mercy: geometry. He saw straight lines where nature preferred curves, discovering an abandoned telegraph line stretching through the trees. He followed the line until it led him to a small log cabin, weathered and silent. For several seconds, he simply stared, afraid his mind had invented it as a cruel trick. But the cabin held its shape. It was real. Inside, he found a rusty stove and a cache of supplies: lard, tinned meat, and a map. His reaction was not triumph, it was release. He sat down and cried, the way men cry when they have been strong for too long and the pressure finally finds a seam. He stayed in the cabin for a week, recovering his strength and warming his bones until they felt less like glass. The map gave him what he had lacked for months: orientation. He fashioned crude snowshoes and a small sled, realizing that travel would now be marginally less punishing. He was still alone, and his body was a ledger of loss, but he had proof that he was not in an unbroken void. He managed the scale of the remaining journey by reducing it to the next bend in the river, and the next night survived. He moved with a rhythm that was less a mantra than a mechanical truth: move, rest, survive. On day 72, Nikolai found another form of geometry: human tracks. They were recent, purposeful, and sharp-edged. He followed them to a logging camp, where he appeared like something dredged from a nightmare, skeletal, bearded, and draped in rags. He called out, his voice raw from disuse, and the loggers recognized him immediately as a man at the edge. They brought him in, fed him slowly, and warmed him. In that moment of contact, Nikolai's control broke again, his body releasing the emotion it had held at bay to survive. He had covered nearly 200 miles of the most unforgiving territory on Earth. He had dropped 60 pounds, but he had not lost his fingers or his mind. He was alive because he had performed a long chain of small, correct things under pressure. Survival, as Nikolai would later reflect, is not a single heroic act. It is a refusal to let despair become a decision. He lived to be 90 years old, returning to his engineering books and his quiet life, downplaying his ordeal as something necessary rather than exceptional. He did not defeat Siberia. He simply endured it long enough to reach the human world. The quiet truth at the center of his story remains. The moment you decide you are going to die, you do, and Nikolai never made that decision.